car crossed the center line at 55-mile undivided highway, no skid marks, 125-mile impact speed, and upside down just like that. They told me I'd be stuck in a wheelchair forever. I was sort of just satisfied that I was alive. My now 10-year-old daughter was outside, she's crying. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I miss my old daddy."
John, welcome to the Modern Masculinity podcast. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It is great to be here.
The listeners, they just heard a little bit about your story. You mentioned before we got started recording, you've been speaking, 4 out of the last 7 days. You're this guy on stage and there's tons of applause and you've sort of gone through your shit, hopefully, or people might say like you've sort of been through your mess and now you're sort of on the back on the, on the victory tour. But I'm curious for you as whether it's a man or a father or a partner or a business owner or a speaker, influencer, author, whatever, any of these roles that you might take on, like what are you still dealing with today as a man that you're still mucking through is sort of what I say.
Yeah. So what's interesting about me is, my story is based off of my whole family being in a horrific car accident 17 years ago. I haven't gone a year in 17 years without a surgery related to the car accident. So I've had over 45 surgeries. So when you say what's still going on, this is sort of a never-ending process. Before we got here today, I was just spent an hour and a half in a hyperbaric chamber trying to avoid having a surgery this year. Being 1, 45 sounds cooler than 46, right? And 2, I love to go a year without having to go into surgery. And so, I'm still constantly trying to improve my health to whatever level. Now, I'm aging on top of this. So, this accident happened at 36. I just turned 54 on Sunday. So I'm battling all of these complications and I'm battling father time. And, I am a gym rat. And part of that reason is because I need to constantly try to keep my body as healthy as possible to make up for all the other issues that we'll talk about later. And so, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a business owner. The speaking part has been in my blood since the car accident. I'm more of a person who's a giver to help people who are overcoming their own setbacks. I've had some pretty serious ones. I know you're a father. Mine happened on the way to a swim meet with an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old in the car on a Saturday afternoon. So it wasn't like I wasn't doing anything that you probably do, or any other parent out there who hasn't gone to a swim meet or a ballet practice or football, name your kid's activity. And, car crossed the center line at 55-mile undivided highway, no skid marks, 125-mile impact speed, and upside down just like that. So, when you say what I'm working on today, I've been working on the same thing for 17 years, trying to be a dad through all that, trying to, be a husband, trying to be a business owner, and constantly getting a setback, being told I'd have surgery again for something, and it hasn't stopped.
What has that been like? Because there's the external side of it where you got to put your body back together. One of my mentors, Hal Elrod, went through something similar, and that is its own journey. But then you've got to maintain and manage your family. You have all these things that you have like externally that you have to sort of put together. But then there's also the John on the inside that just went through this tragic event. Like what was that interaction like between those two worlds, right? The inner world, John, and the outer John. Were they in step? Were they at take us into what that was like?
Yeah, they weren't in step, honestly, until really recently, last couple of years, that I've really worked on the inner John part of it. And some of that was a combination of, one, the constant surgeries, the constant rehabilitations, the constant make progress, and then be told, well, this new surgery is going to make you not be able to lift more than 10 pounds for the next 10 weeks. So running a business, raising, 2 kids, and trying to make sure their opportunities weren't so negatively impacted by me. I mean, one of the parts of my story is that 2.5 years after the accident, my now 10-year-old daughter was outside juggling a soccer ball while I'm sitting in this office watching her. And I look up and she's not there. And she comes in and she's crying. And I just assumed she hurt herself. And so I pull into this chair and she sits down and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I miss my old daddy, the one who would train with me." And I literally quit outpatient rehab the next day and started training on my own. And that's a lot of my story, is that I became somewhat known in media for this guy who was supposed to be broken and then took over his own therapy and training. But that was a personal, you know, hurt on myself to have her say that and motivate me to, push myself harder to try to be available for my kids. But, the mental part of John, the part that was struggling with, survivor's remorse, the one who was dealing with PTSD of, the accident, I just kept pushing that down for a long time. I just kept pulling up my bootstraps and doing what I thought I had to do. My last child left for college 3 years ago. He's now a senior in college. And it wasn't until I was really left with an empty nest of no golf tournaments and soccer tournaments and other parent chasing things that I felt like I could, one, write the book that I wrote, two, work on my mental health.
Yeah. There's nothing in comparison. Obviously, I had to have, I have limited range of motion in my hand. There was one, I cut my hand open, really bad on a Christmas Eve one day. And I remember having this inner thought of like, I'm never going to be able to lift weights again. Right. And it's, once again, it's so far removed from your situation. And also, I would imagine that a lot of guys experience these events and then they're like these stories that we tell ourselves. And similar to you, I think that there was a disagreement with that sort of belief, right? Like we sort of refuse to let that be our reality. And I'm curious, you said you just sort of pulled your bootstraps up and, you just kind of kept going. Like in the book, which we'll talk about, it seems like it's a very practical, it was just like, it was go through this horrible thing, then like, yeah, I'll do this and make a plan and like write it out. And I was like, I love that it's practical and it's not just a raw inspirational. And was it just that? Or was there was there an inner shift that had to happen first? Or had that already happened in your life? And, this was sort of the impetus. I'm sort of playing devil's advocate for, a guy who looks at the book and goes like, oh, it's too simple, or I've heard this before, or, whatever excuses they may be saying to themselves.
Well, it is simple. I mean, honestly, most of the best things that we're supposed to be doing in life are simple. It's generally not the plan, it's the execution, right? You could get any really successful business's business plan, and they'd probably be willing to share it because it's not the secret sauce, it's the execution, right? And so for me, there's been plenty of setbacks in which, over the 17 years, it would take me months, sometimes a year, just to give myself enough grace to say, you know what, it's okay that you can't get yourself up right now where you are, that, you're not ready. I mean, one of my first principles, my first pillar is commitment. Like there's plenty of times when people think they want to tackle something, but they don't really have the commitment. But maybe they don't have the bandwidth right now. Maybe they don't have the support. Maybe they don't have the know-how. There's a whole lot of things that go into commitment besides just saying, I want this. And so there were plenty of times where I would be like, I knew what to do, and I still choose that I'm not ready to do it. And particularly after I've done it 5, 6, 7 times, and each time ended up falling backwards into, some surgery or some other setback. And it is that simple. But, the reality is that if you don't love the process that you're going through, you just won't ever really be happy with the goal. Like the beauty is in the process, right? So if I hated going to the gym, putting myself through that every day and didn't like the people that were there and didn't make relationships, I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have stayed with it long term. If you hate the idea of having to learn and get better at something, you're never going to be really good at it, right? Podcasting, I'm sure it's a learning process for you constantly. If you didn't love it, you wouldn't be doing it anymore because it's a lot of commitment. It's a lot of time.
Yeah, it's for sure it is those things. And I think that there is something inherent about being challenged in this sort of way, at least in terms of being masculine, right? I think, the feminine has its own journey. I would be curious for someone who really studies it if there is a heroine's journey, right? That's different from the hero's journey. And, maybe the feminists would sort of hate that, but whatever. They're probably not listening. I've already pissed them off in the first 100 episodes. That's okay. But I think that if you look at all of the, classic stories a lot of times they begin with like tragedy. I know that as writers, and it's a tool to really heighten the stakes and really create a lot of, emotional investment and yada, yada, yada. And also, I think that men are sort of given these opportunities to stretch themselves, to find out what their commitment is, find out what they are committed to. I saw or I heard or read, I don't know, remember, it gets all fuzzy these days, but it's something to the effect of when you realize what you are willing to die for, like therein lies your values, therein lies your, like, that's really what you're committed to. And I think that a lot of times men are confronted with that answer when these things happen, whether it's our daughter or our family or ourselves or whatever, these things sort of push us up against those realities, and we're sort of forced to answer that question or not. I'd imagine that the guys that are listening to this show and have made it this far, they're wanting to answer the call, but hopefully they see it in that regard and not some damning sentence that says that they're forever defined as blank.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest, ahas for me through this process, and even when I finally started to try to write the book, which was nothing more than taking concepts that I was already using in my life and giving them a name, right, was that the setbacks, the challenges, the accident itself were all more learning than any of the real successes. I mean, it's a little cliche to say, you learn more from failures than successes, but it's 100% true. When you're succeeding and doing something well, what you want to hold on to is the status quo. And the status quo is the hardest freaking thing to hold on to that there is. Like, generally in everything, you're either probably going forward or going backward, right? It's really hard to just maintain something. And so every time I thought I was in a maintenance mode, something else would medically or health wise or relationship wise would throw me backwards. And again, coming back and restarting again allowed me to rethink how I was going to do it this time. Again, getting knocked down over and over again doesn't necessarily feel great, but at a certain point, it also becomes something that you get skilled at dealing with. Like, not being knocked down over and over again and having, luck constantly fall in your lap, you don't learn anything, and you certainly won't know how to handle adversity when it happens. And so, I've had enough setbacks. They don't scare me anymore. Whether that is health related, relationship related, work related. When you almost die and you're given 3% chance to survive, everything kind of seems borrowed time anyway, right?
Well, that's how I feel right now. Most of the time, I use this as an opportunity for like therapy and self therapy and to share my experiences, what I've been through. But no, it's like fucking what? So are you sorry, dude? You went through a divorce. Okay, cry me a fucking river, And also, like, the worst. Again, I'm terrible at paraphrasing things, but it's something the effect of like the worst thing to happen to someone is the worst thing that's happened to somebody.
Yeah.
And we are the blessed or cursed with these sort of events and opportunities. And to your point, it's just, are we doing the things that allow us to move forward? And at least for me, and again, I only have the context of a 30-something-year-old guy. I look at today's world and I just think, I don't know if I can win everybody over in saying that being a man is harder today. I don't know if that's the case. However, I think it's more complicated because there's just more going on. There's more to deal with. It feels like at least men of previous generations, they could get away with sort of being great in one area. Maybe they were a great businessman, but classic examples of people who were great in business, but had a terrible family life, or great in one area and not so great in the other. And at least it seems, and I don't know if it's the expectation that guys have today, but it seems like more and more guys want to have a holistic sort of experience. And that for me is sort of the challenge, because just being healthy is one battle. Just being a good parent is another battle. Having a business is another battle. Having, your own sanity is another battle. And then you've got to deal with all of them while the world seems to be sort of falling apart. And it's like, that's, at least that for me, I'm like, okay, that's what guys are dealing with today. And I could see that being a little overwhelming for most.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big takeaways for me through all of this is that as I was recovering, particularly over the first 5, 6 years, I don't have so much energy in my body because my body was constantly healing itself and I was constantly going through surgeries. So I had I had so many hours in a day. Maybe, sometimes it's 6 hours, maybe it's 8 hours, but I had to divide that between work, my health and exercise, physical therapy, and my kids. And sometimes work, I tried to not take away from the health part because I thought in the end, taking care of my body and getting myself in better shape was going to benefit everybody else involved. So that was my number one priority. But sometimes my wife and kids never got enough from me because that day work took too much from me. And they kind of learned to know this. And so if I was sitting in my chair and it was 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, and I'm not talking to anybody, they didn't talk to me either because I had reached sort of my max that I could give, and anything that was going to come out of me at that point was not going to be quality and not going to help anybody. And sometimes it was just lose my shit, or so that was the reality my family dealt with for a long time, which was dad's only got so much to give, and today it was already taken before we got home from school.
And if you look back on that, obviously we try not to have regrets. Like, there's no past judgment, but in a perfect world, or if you could whisper to that person, the guy that's going through that in that moment, or go back to that guy, like, is it just grace? Or looking back on it, are there things where you're like, well, actually, maybe we could have tinkered with this a little bit, turned this dial and knob a little bit, created space here? Like, is there things looking back on it that from a tactical perspective, you could have done a little differently to have more of that? Or is it just like, we just, we need to have grace, and there's only limited amount of energy that can have in a day?
The first 2.5 years, they told me I'd be stuck in a wheelchair forever. Within the 2 years, I could walk with a walker. I was already kind of defying odds, but I wasn't pushing I was sort of just satisfied that I was alive. And I didn't think I was giving as much as I could. I mean, there was some resentment. The accident wasn't our fault. The other driver wasn't under drugs or drinking, but he was distracted across the center line, no skid marks. So neither one of us saw each other. I had some resentment about the fact that it happened to us. He had no insurance. It wasn't like I had some big lawsuit win from this accident that wasn't our fault. All we had is expense and injury and hurt. Like I said, I think one of the, I struggled with survivor's remorse for a while. Why was I here? Right? I was getting less than 3% chance. Why am I still on this earth? What's God's plan for me? What am I supposed to be doing? And a friend who happened to be a pastor said to me, maybe you're just here so your kids have a dad. And so that was the first answer anyone gave me. And that was more than a year and a half after the accident, that I felt like, okay, yeah. And then for my daughter to tell me she misses her old daddy and then I should be out in the yard playing with her was a catalyst to motivate me to work harder than I had been. Part of my story is my left lung completely collapsed because my diaphragm was ruptured. My right lung was partially collapsed. I was alive for over 2 hours with just half of a lung, but I was a marathon runner. I'd run 12 miles that morning. And so I was 185 pounds, 6'2", and probably like 9% body fat. It saved my life too, right? It did. And so I knew what it was like to push. I just wasn't willing to put myself through. I mean, I was taking 90 milligrams of morphine twice a day to function. I knew I couldn't survive that either. I couldn't just keep doing that. So, I had this narcotic issue.
Do you attribute your survival, or any, whatever, if any of a percentage, to your being in such good shape?
Yeah, I've received awards for survival, which is the weirdest thing in the world because the only thing I can claim that I did to help me survive was be physically fit. And it just happened to be that I was, right? But everything else is God and surgeons. I can take credit for what happened 18 days after I came out of my coma going forward, but I had nothing to do with my own survival other than the fact that I was in good shape.
Hopefully this is not distasteful, and it might not even be true, but it's a meme that goes around in the gym sort of world where, some guy gets shot in the back and he says that the bullet got lodged in his back muscles, and he says that his muscles were so tight after a heavy back day. And so it's like, if you ever need an excuse to lift heavy, here it is. I think that's a gross exaggeration of what you're saying. And also, to someone who may or may not experience, something as tragic as what you've gone through, being in health, that the proactive measures that we are putting in, you can't necessarily see that. You can't see the results or the impact that that's going to have. And also, it's one of those things that, like, you can't do afterwards either. it's got to be done, in advance and in preparation of whenever something is going to happen.
Yeah, I feel like, again, so like I said, I was a 185-pound runner. Today, I'm still about 9.5% body fat. I'm 220 pounds. And it can throw around a lot of weight. And I'm missing half my abdominal muscles. My pelvis was shattered. My back was broken. I have no feeling in my left leg, but I can still do all those things. And you can't buy that. Like, I couldn't buy running a marathon, no matter what shots they wanted to give me or do anything. I had to earn all of that. And since the accident, putting myself back together, you know, I have a lot of titanium in me, bolts and plates and screws and mesh, but my physical strength and my ability to hold most of my body together, I only have half of my abdominal muscles. I had to earn it all. There was no cheat code that was going to get me able to squat 400 pounds or, bench over 300 pounds. Like, that just came with time and perseverance and hard work and, and a lot of setbacks that put me backwards, and then turned around and decided a year later I'm ready to do it again.
So one of the things that has sort of, come up is the idea of setbacks. And I think that for me, guys are going to deal with them, and the sort of I don't know if the antidote, I've been watching some superhero movies and maybe that's why that word is coming around. But like, the thing to push past those, at least in my opinion, or experience, has been like our identity. Like, how do we see ourselves? And it seems like you sort of had this mental image, this vision of yourself that was a marathon runner, that was fit, that was strong, that was, you held that in your head. And then you had this sort of setback that moved you sort of off course. And at least it seems like you were going to do the things that were in alignment and that were fit with that identity. You already had seen that for yourself. And it was almost getting back to status quo, right? And I would imagine that most guys, the status quo is sort of not what they're fighting to get to, but what I would imagine that a lot of them are redefining or trying to stretch that identity of who they are. Is that something you see in like, is that something that makes any sense to you? And if a guy who's coming in and they're like, I interact with guys and see guys who they struggle with self-worth, and you look at them and they don't see themselves as blank, insert ideal. How does, if at all, does things change for someone like that?
Well, so here's the part that's interesting. I did think for a really long time, well, that all I wanted to do was get back to where I was, right? And it wasn't until I was able to let go of that concept that I wasn't ever going to be myself again, that my options were going to be some new version of myself. And again, I liked the version of myself when the accident happened at 36, right? So it was ideal to want to get back to there, but the longer, I pushed towards that goal, the more I realized that was an unobtainable goal, and it was only going to lead to disappointment. Running to be able to run again was never going to happen, and certainly not at a level that I was going to feel like I was as good as I was before. You know, I could go from a 6.5 minute mile to about 12 and a half at the very best I ever did after the accident. And it was painful and it was not a good idea. And so, I did need to come to terms with the fact that I needed a new vision of what I was supposed to be. The other part, Hector, that I think you'll find interesting listening to some of your podcasts in the past, you know, I did have this vision of myself, but really what drove me was not disappointing other people, not letting my kids down, not letting down my wife, not letting down my business partners, not letting down my family. At the end of the day, what really motivated me was not becoming this. I mean, I could have gone on completely on, Social Security dependency. Like, there was nobody who was going to say, oh, this guy can go back to work, or this guy, I could have just stayed in a wheelchair. I could have not done, I didn't want to be that burden to anybody. And so, I went from being pretty successful 30s, middle of my 30s with two kids and a marriage to, being completely broken to the fact that, I couldn't be moved for 10 weeks where I lay flat on my back. And I always say sponge baths are overrated. They're not as exciting as you might think. I mean, I couldn't do anything for myself. So super humble, super humiliated, humiliated from just the fact that I was just deteriorating and falling apart. But what pushed me every day to not whine and bitch about it was the fact I didn't want to be a disappointment. I don't think it's super healthy, but that's what pushed me. What pushed me hard in the gym was this whole concept that I could control the pain I was causing myself versus the pain from the accident that was constantly living with me that I couldn't control. And so what drove me to push myself really hard in the gym was because it's, as you know, it's all of a sudden what used to make you sore doesn't make you sore. It's like addiction, right? A drugs. Like you just got to push yourself harder if you want that soreness and that pain. So it was never about lifting a certain amount of weight. It was always this concept of, can I push myself harder so tonight when I go to bed, instead of thinking about how bad my back and my pelvis hurt, I'm thinking about my shoulders hurting because I literally did that to myself. And I have control over that.
Talk to me about how you see habits in your life. Do they play a role in this process and sort of getting someone from being, in a word, broken to thriving, maybe?
Yeah. Oh, again, as a whole, forming a habit is nothing more than repetitive first steps, right? So, a habit is just developed by taking a first step and doing it every day, right? So it's definitely from the term habit as we would use it, it's 100% what it is. I would say habits become lifestyle changes, and lifestyle changes bring you change. But at the very basic, you're developing a habit. And obviously, some habits stick with you and some habits don't. And ultimately, what I would argue they stay is because you get some sort of satisfaction from performing it, whether it's the high of a runner or whether it's, the feeling from after a gym workout, or, it's the success that comes from getting a chapter done in your book. Hate the process, which I kind of mentioned earlier. You're just not going to develop the skill. You're not going to get the change that's permanent because there's plenty of stories of people losing a whole lot of weight afterwards, but they hated exercise and they hated tracking their diet and their food. And what do you see? A couple of years later, they put the weight back on. It was always about the goal and the finish line of getting to this weight. It was never about falling in love with the process of going to the gym and eating cleaner and watching your diet. It was just like, I want to lose the weight. I want to be this weight. And so I'm going to do everything I can as fast as I can to get there. But as soon as I'm done doing that work.
Yeah, for sure. We're recording this at a time where I think the medical term is like GLP-1s, or there are these drugs essentially that are making people skinnier without the hard work, without the work. I don't know if I would say healthier necessarily, the verdict is still out. When you see things like that, or even it's coming out that now people who are using AI, that they're having they're showing cognitive decline, or like they're showing like their reduction in their cognitive ability after using AI. There are all these things that sort of enable guys to get out of that hard work, that effort, if they want to. How do you look at sort of phenomenon like that and how guys might approach those sort of?
Well, I would argue that instantaneous success has very little value in your quality of your life. It's like how many times you hear a story of somebody wins a major lottery and 10 years later they're bankrupt. They didn't do anything to get that wealth. They didn't know how to manage it. They didn't go through the learning process through it, right? I said earlier, one thing you can't buy, I mean, you can take steroids, but steroids don't do anything if you don't go to the gym. Muscle is earned. Can you make yourself bigger by taking drugs? Yes, but you still have to go to the gym. They don't do anything unless you go and actually put the workout in, right? When we talk about these weight loss drugs, I think there's probably a place for them. It's certainly in obesity, where your health literally is diabetics, people who are literally going to die if they don't lose weight. There's a place for that. If you need to lose an extra 20 pounds to look better in a pair of jeans, it feels like you're screwing around with your health, when what you really need to do is take care of your health, literally make good changes in your lifestyle. But I can also understand the concept of not being able to give up something. I have an interesting story because I was on narcotics and I was addicted to narcotics. I had to go through withdrawal to get off them, but I had a physical addiction. I didn't have the mental addiction of needing them in order to function in my life, but I still had to go through the withdrawal. And I still knew that at any time during that 3 to 5 day period of time that I did went through withdrawal twice, that I could have just taken the medicine and felt better and didn't have to go through it. But when you see people not being able to get themselves lose weight, not be able to get themselves off the drugs, I don't look at them and go, oh, you're weak. You can't push. I look at it and say, look, one, you're not ready, obviously. Two, you need to find a way to put yourself in an environment in which you're now willing to at least explore getting better, right? Listen to a podcast, start to find people who kind of align with what you want to do, and then slowly move that way. I just don't think that there's a pill or a shot or anything that we can just take that's going to make us all better. There shouldn't be, by the way. You should want to have to work at something to have something that you want. And again, we talk about being a father. I mean, that's something I still am my kids. You have to work hard, and that's still no guarantee. But if you want to take shortcuts, try to cheat your way up, is it the only person you're going to really end up hurting in the end is yourself. And they've got to watch me, from they were 4 and 8 years old, go through surgery after surgery and go to the gym after gym. And if anything, I think I've shown them one that success isn't necessarily measured with the dollar sign. Number one, success is measured in I said I want to do something and I go after it. And when I don't get it and I fall backwards, I just keep, what's the saying is you're only done when you quit. If you don't quit, you're still in the game. And so, I think that is crucial to ultimately achieving your goal. And, I keep emphasizing it, but I'm such a strong believer in falling in love with that process more than the outcome, that it's the foundation, I think, of anybody who's been really successful in anything they set out to do, was that they found a way to just love the grind, love the process. Athletes who there's no such thing as a great athlete who hates practice. They don't exist. So if you don't like the process, the camaraderie of the people, the activities you got to do there, whether it's podcasting, writing a book, exercising, fathering, being a spouse, like if you hate it, you're just not going to be good at it. Doesn't matter what the society tells you, this is what the outcome should be.
One of the things that has helped in this whole thing, and perhaps it's just in making myself feel better, but is trying to lengthen the finish line, right? I used to judge myself harshly if I don't do this by this time, if I don't have this by this time, if I used to be married and then have kids, and like there were all these benchmarks. And I remember playing the game of life, as a kid, thinking like, okay, like this is what I've got to do. And I think that put frankly, a lot of fear, because there was a lot of worry if it doesn't work out, like it has to work out in this time, right? Like this, even like this lifetime, this whatever. And as I've sort of tried to lengthen the finish line and say like, I'm given these set of experiences for my like soul to evolve. Like the human is going to go through its own sort of experience, but what's underneath that's sort of going to take all of those experiences with them. Hopefully, at least this is my belief, is that underneath that person is this soul that sort of carries our learnings, right? The wisdom, the insights, and how we've responded. And so if I can look at life's current challenges, not just in this smaller sample set of this lifetime, but in actually these series of lifetimes, in this, catalog of lifetimes, if you will, even, then maybe even this life just gets a little bit easier to deal with, right? It's like a little bit easier to bear, because there were moments, when I was going through my divorce and like all these sorts of things where it's like, why do I have to experience this, right? And it was a real question, where it was like, why am I going through this? And the only answer that made me feel better was because like you're supposed to, like this is what you're meant to go through and meant to experience in order to become not only the person, but the soul that you are meant to be. And I feel like more guys could wake up to that, because it sounds really woo woo. And, I've gone off on the show here about my, journey with religion and spirituality. But I would invite guys at least to consider an approach like that, because otherwise shit can be so hard these days. It can feel so heavy. It could feel like I could see how someone can just look outside or look on their feed or look wherever and go like, what is even the point?
Yeah. I mean, so here's the thing. I think, Hector, you and I are both messengers at this point. If you said, what is your role? It's to get a message out to help people feel better about where they are in their lives and give a little of guidance. You don't go through your experiences. I don't go through my experiences. Our message isn't the same, right? And so if you're called to be a messenger, if you're called to take your experiences and then choose to share them with people, you're putting yourself on a journey that opens yourself up to acknowledging failures and successes, right? I mean, if we sat here and just talked about nothing but successes, people just call bullshit, right? Because nobody has that kind of life. And so, one of the big things that for me is to come back and say, yeah, I've had really bad periods where I just didn't feel like, you know, doing anything because I just got sick of being put back down again or dealing with another setback. I've had times when I left the hospital, I got moved into a nursing home for 8 more weeks where I had to lay flat on my back. I wish so many times that I would have just died. I wrote the first part of my book 14 years ago for my kids as a memoir. And when I finally agreed to write the second part this year and actually publish it, I went back and put the dark stuff back in. I took it all out for my kids because I thought, especially when I first wrote it, they were like 12, and 16 years old. But there were a lot of dark times in it. And there are a lot of times where, the setbacks and everything just felt like shit. And I didn't want to do it. And I put it back in because I think people need to understand that, yes, I think part of it is how I'm wired, but that's why I'm on your podcast and why you even do a podcast. It's how you're wired. So, part of it is just this determination that's built in you, but a lot of it is just this sheer fact that I just didn't give up, even when I felt like giving up. Or when I did give up, I gave myself enough grace to say, okay, you just don't have it in you right now. And that doesn't mean that you're never going to have it in you, but maybe you just need to take a step back and just breathe a little bit. I think, in a society that's constantly pushing, particularly men, to just push, succeed, to do all these things you said earlier. You have to be good at 5, 6 different, you got to wear 5 or 6 different hats and be good at all of them and be, just this Renaissance man, if you will, right? You can't be all those things. And I certainly can't. I'm terrible at multitasking. I'm pretty good at one thing, but don't ask me to do, 3 or 4 things at one time. And part of it is understanding yourself too. And that comes from more times than failing and saying, well, I suck at this, and I consider the sign of success the ability to either outsource or hire people who do things that you suck at, like your editor, right? Like, someone's going to edit this to make it sound better, right? That's what they do. They're good at it. Let them do what they do well. I spend a lot of time researching my doctors, but once I commit to a doctor, they're my doctor and I do what they tell me to do because they're the expert, not me. Now, if I have a doctor that tells me they don't think I'd ever should walk again and I should just be happy the way I am, I got rid of that doctor. But, when I found the right people, I call them the right board of directors, the right group of people in your life, then you got to trust them too. And so sometimes it's also just building the team of people who compensate for the stuff you suck at. And I think that's enlightened, understanding what you're not good at.
Are there any other stories that you were surprised made it in or that you went back and forth on getting?
Yeah, it'll be interesting, Hector, whether you can keep this and you decide to. And I completely understand if you don't, but there's a part that's not in my book. There's a gap in my life since the accident speaking, about 15 years ago. So the accident happened 17 and a half years ago. When I started to go back to the gym, I started to get some momentum picked up by local magazines, local newspapers, local news. I was working out at our local YMCA with Down syndrome young adults. That became my workout partners. And that story resonated locally. That ended up putting me in People magazine, putting me in a feature piece in Men's Fitness magazine, had me traveling around the country to speak to organizations about, this was also the recession. So the stock market, the housing market had crashed. I was the feel-good keynote breakfast speaker at big conferences where everything sucked. But on Wednesday morning, before everybody left, they had the last breakfast. They had me, and they would be like, well, everything sucks, but at least we're not that guy. But I had a ton of momentum that just came organically from, just the magazines back then. That, magazines had a shelf and you could go in the grocery store and find a bunch of them. But 12 years ago in August, my best friend, who was super involved in taking care of my family when I was hurt, committed suicide. And, that shook my world. Here's the guy who pushed me super hard to get better, who was a big power lifter, super successful in his career, took his own life. His kids were my godchildren, same age as my kids. He was the one who made sure that for, over a year, my son got a haircut. Now I literally cleared my entire slate. It happened in August. I had a whole bunch of scheduled speaking around the country, and I canceled all of it. And I said, one, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm too pissed off at him. I now got to go make sure that his kids are okay. And I can't tell my story anymore without not being able to say what happened to him. And this was, 12 years ago, we could talk about suicide and didn't get blocked out everywhere. And, now I'm aware that I can't go on social and have a normal conversation about it. It's really difficult to put out there. But, it wasn't until those kids are 26 and 22 now, about to be 23, graduated from college, had really successful college careers in sports. I'm super proud of them as much as I'm proud of my own kids. But it wasn't until I could have an adult conversation with them that I could even go back out and start talking, because I couldn't tell my story without telling the story of their dad as well. And so, yeah, that never made it in the book. I talk about it in keynotes all the time. I'll bring it up in these podcasts, but obviously I'm not going to be upset if you're like, it's just too difficult to push through YouTube and all these places if you have the word suicide in it. But he's a grown man and took his own life. And I didn't understand the mental health of it. I mean, I had to put myself in therapy a couple of years ago just to learn to process and be okay with this concept of mental health. Because again, I didn't do the work. When the accident happened, I just had setback after setback. So it wasn't really, it's been 2.5 years of me in therapy with a therapist who specializes with soldiers with PTSD and drug addicts. Like, I needed I needed a therapist that I could swear at across the table and tell him to fuck off if I want to. And he can tell me the same thing before I could even, deal with my friend who committed suicide, all my challenges with surviving and setbacks. I don't have a very big emotional range right now. I haven't cried in 15 years. I don't think that's healthy, but it's just sort of where I am. But I've also had to learn to block pain out. And pain is, both physical and mental pain. And when you learn to block physical pain, you block mental pain as well, fear, sadness. And so it's nothing I'm proud of at all. I wish I had it, not to the extent that it comes with the pain of the physical stuff that I've had to learn to deal with without narcotics. So that might be heavy, but that's what's not in the book.
Have you pursued any like somatic work or breath work or body, that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to talk about, the things that I chose to do to get off of narcotics, again, this was before the narcotics epidemic, though, when I went off. And it wasn't that anybody was asking me to get off them. Everyone was like, you need them. But I had already seen how it works, right? 30 milligrams of morphine became 60, 60 became 90. Fentanyl patches stopped working. Like, your body just builds up tolerance. So, I could see where we were going. I was losing my ability to remember stuff. And so when I decided to go off, we did it gradually, went from 90 to 60 over 6 months. But I worked through biofeedback. I worked through breath work. I work a lot of acupuncture. My acupuncturist today has been my acupuncturist for 16 years. So I can tell you at the time, there was no insurance who wanted to pay for alternative pain management. They were all more than willing to pay for narcotics. But, the alternative stuff was also at my expense and our ability to learn about it. And I live in a pretty rural part of Pennsylvania. So, even finding practitioners who practiced it was a challenge. Prayer works better for me as a form of meditation than, trying to do breath, quiet work where, My leg has a lot of nerve damage, my left one. So it basically feels like my leg's asleep all the time. So just even learning to focus, have any kind of reading comprehension when, try doing something when your hand's asleep all the time. It's a huge distraction. So it took me years just to even tune out the white noise, which is this nerve damage that runs through my body all the time.
Yeah. I mean, so much of my journey has been getting that stored. For me, it was emotional pain. Getting that out, and breath work has been helpful in that. I have friends that really enjoy. I think it's called rolfing. It's like they do like really deep muscle work, and there's these viral Instagram videos where people are just howling. Both from the physical release and then also the emotional sort of stuff that's sort of caught in there. Fantastic.
Right. Yeah, I love Eastern medicine. And then when you can find a good hybrid of Western and Eastern medicine, I think that is ultimately the best type of medical care that you can get. And so I've been fortunate to be able to find those types of physicians and people who are, I'm a unique case. So in most cases, they're always interested because, people say, I don't have anybody like you, but I'm interested to see what happens. And if you tell me that, then I know you're in.
They're interested. We'll see how this goes. They're like,
Yeah.
they can't screw it up. At least it's already, it's already been through the ringer.
The best is when I walk in to see a new doctor after they see my files and they're like, this is not what we expected to see when you walked in. They said, you look really good, but you look like shit on paper.
Better to have it that way. John, that's where we're going to wrap it. I got two questions for you. One is if people want to find out about you, the book, where's the best place to go?
So my website is johnulsh.com. There you can find pre-orders for the book. Like I said, October 7th is the release date. It's on pre-order for all the normal Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the pre-order online sites. You can order it anywhere. The website talks a little bit more about, some of my story. My social is John Ulsh. So that's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. So you can find me there. We do a lot of social posts right now. I've got a great team of people who like I recorded 2 hours of content today. So we're just constantly just trying to get stories out. There's some videos of me like I take good care of my health, but I build into my diet 4 ounces of bourbon. I don't know if you see the bottles around here, but I drink 4 ounces of bourbon every day. It's my thing. I'm not giving it up. I will smoke a cigar once a week, probably in the summertime, and maybe not as often in the winter in central Pennsylvania. Now it's freezing my ass outside. But, I'll talk about the fact that, what? I still have some habits that aren't perfect, but that's life. I want to live my life too. So that stuff's on my social. It's fun stuff that we put on there.
Amazing. We'll link all that up in the show notes and description. And John, my last question is, in your opinion, what is the definition of modern masculinity?
Oh man, if you would have asked me a couple years ago versus today, my understanding of it now is self-aware men. I feel like we can no longer be put into some sort of mold that says this is what you should be. If you want to be successful and run a successful business and you don't really want a family life, that should be an option. But if you want to be a stay-at-home dad and you have a spouse that's going to bring in the income, then that should be what you want to be. I mean, I think we get, the old school stereotypes we talked about earlier. I don't think you have to wear 5 hats, but I also don't think you should corner yourself into, this idea that this is what it looks like because this is what your dad did, or this is what somebody you look up to did. I think, owning your own vision of what you want is what I really teach. That's it. Find out what that big why is for you and then figure out, how to get it. There's all going to be shit around you all the time, right? But as a man, one, owning it. I think there's a feminine and I think there's a masculine. We didn't really dive in that, but I think there is a role that as a man you're going to play, but I don't think it has to be so segregated up into this idea that you're the one who rolls out the trash. I'm an excellent cook. So is my brother. My mother worked when we were kids and we learned to cook. I love to cook. I don't think we have these roles outside of the fact that I think there's a built into most of us to be protectors. I think women are built to be nurturers. Could there be reasons that those things change? Absolutely. But as a whole, it's what drives me. It's why I said I didn't want to be a burden to my family. I didn't want to be a burden to my kids and my wife. I felt it was my responsibility, no matter how broken I was, to repair myself, to protect and take care of my family.